What if the real story of ancient Israel wasn't centered in Jerusalem? What if it was hidden deliberately out here in the wilderness? Not in a temple, not amongst Pharisees, not amongst Sadducees, but in the deserts of Qumran. Just over a dozen miles from Jerusalem, close enough to watch, far enough to be separate, there lived a community history nearly erased. Ancient historian Flavius Josephus tells us something that most people never hear in synagogue or seminary. He says that there were thousands of Essenes, not dozens, not a fringe group, but thousands. Estimates hover around 4,000, spread throughout Judea and the concentrated communities living by the Dead Sea in Qumran. That alone should stop us in our tracks. Because if thousands of devout, disciplined Jews rejected the Jerusalem priesthood, the question isn't why were they extreme? The question is, what did they see that everybody else ignored? The Essenes weren't rebels. They weren't pagans. They were hyper-biblical, obsessed with purity, obsessed with covenant faithfulness, obsessed with proper priesthood. And this is where things get uncomfortable. The Essenes claimed descent from the Zadok priesthood, the original line established under King David and Solomon. In other words, they believed the temple priests in Jerusalem were illegitimate, corrupt, politically compromised, and installed by foreign powers. That's not minor disagreement. That's a full-blown indictment of the religious establishment. Here's another detail that rarely gets airtime. The Essenes movement predates the full development of the Pharisees and Sadducees. Those groups rose to prominence during the Hasmonean period after political power and priesthood became entangled. The Essenes didn't adapt to that system. They walked away from it. And just like Isaiah said, the voice would cry out. Qumran wasn't random. It sat along key desert routes. It overlooked the Dead Sea. It was isolated, but not unreachable. Close enough to Jerusalem to monitor the temple activity, yet far enough to remain uncontaminated. This was not escapism. This was watchfulness. Among the Dead Sea Scrolls are text scholars call the sectarian writings, not biblical copies, but internal documents. The community rule lays out their theology, hierarchy, discipline, and expectations. And here's the controversial part. These writings don't get preached. They don't get taught. They rarely get contextualized for the public. Why? Because they expose the parallel Jewish world, one deeply biblical, fiercely messianic, and openly critical of Jerusalem's leadership. The Essenes used a method called pesher, which simply means this: they believed ancient scripture were speaking directly to them, not metaphorically, not abstractly, but now. So instead of saying pesher interpretations, let's be plain, they were prophetic interpretations, applying biblical prophecy to real people, real events, and real corruption happening around them. And that alone should sound familiar. The Essenes weren't just theologians, they were apocalyptic thinkers. They knew and believed that they were living in the last days of an age. They expected a final battle between light and darkness, a purification of the priesthood, and a righteous teacher who would rightly interpret the law. This wasn't fringe paranoia. This was structured, scriptural expectations, and it shaped everything that they did. The scrolls speak repeatedly of a figure they called the teacher of righteousness, not mythologized, but recognized as one that would rightly reveal God's will. And here's where the lines usually get blurred or avoided altogether. The Essenes weren't inventing a new Messiah. They were waiting for the fulfillment of Scripture. And from a Christian perspective, that trajectory doesn't end in Qumran. It points forward to Jesus. Jesus didn't appear in a theological vacuum. His language, his critiques of the priestly corruption, his wilderness connections, his emphasis on inner purity over ritual theater, none of that shocked first century Judea. It terrified the establishment because others were saying the exact same thing. The Essenes didn't create Christianity, they prepared the grounds for it. But let's face it, a movement like Qumran is inconvenient. For Judaism, it challenges the legitimacy of the temple leadership. For Christianity, it complicates the out-of-nowhere narrative. For institutions, it proves God was moving outside of the official channels, so the story gets minimized, fragmented, filed under interesting but irrelevant. Except it's not irrelevant, it's foundational. Qumran wasn't just a desert commune, it was a community watching, waiting, preparing, not only for their time, but for the latter generation that would see the coming of the Messiah once again.